Hello and welcome to this module in our Tetration video series. My name's Rob and I'm here with Tim, and in this module we're going to talk about provided services with Tetration policy. Now Tim, in one of the previous modules on the Tetration workspaces, we looked at an existing application and we explored the basic policy constructs and how the discovered policy was actually put together. If we take a look at the actual elements of that policy, we'll see that these purple boxes that you see on the screen, they're those consumer and provider groups.
Yep.
The purple ones represent the clusters that are inside the application itself, so the discovered groups within this particular scope.
Okay, so that's parts that are internal to my application.
Internal to the application, they're also what is listed, and there's much further detail on each of those clusters in the actual clusters section of the UI.
Okay.
The blue box down here is a scope. Now, because this is a scope, it's outside of the application itself, it's an external dependency.
Okay.
And what you can see here is that in this case, there's an external scope called Campus, and it's accessing the banking web cluster inside our application. So of all of the workloads, the subgroups within the scope, one of those groups is exposing a service that is accessed by an external consumer.
Okay, so you're saying Campus users may only access the banking web group over port 443.
That's right. We haven't exposed all of the workloads and all of the different server types. That doesn't really make sense in this case. It's the web front end that those users should be accessing, so we've restricted their access just to that group on, in this case, this particular TCP port 443. Okay.
Makes sense.
What do you think would happen, Tim, if, let's say, another application was to also need access into the banking web tier of our application?
Well, I'd probably want them to only be able to access the web tier, just like we saw here. Especially things I have some critical services like databases. I really don't want anyone to access that for sure.
Exactly.
But you mentioned that the cluster itself, it's an internal component of the application. So.
Yep.
Can I refer to that if I'm outside of this application?
Yes, you can. And that's really what we're referring to in terms of provided services within the application.
Okay.
Now, if we have a look at the actual clusters in this application, we have our banking web app tier here. And you can see that that was dynamic. It was approved. And over on the sort of top right section here, you'll see that we've got different buttons. One is the approval, the thumbs up. One is to edit and to change the clustering itself. But the other one is to promote to inventory filter.
Okay.
Now, we've discussed filters in other modules as well as just one of the other policy objects that we have to refer to. And what this does, if we were to promote to an inventory filter, it gives us the flexibility to actually expose this specific service to be consumed by external providers as they perform their own dependency mappings and they discover their policy.
So right now, if it's still in the state of being a cluster, if I was in a different application, if I was in the data lake application, for example, I would not be able to refer to that individual cluster.
Correct. So let's take a look at what that might look like. So we'll switch applications. We'll switch to a different workspace. In this case, we're going to step into Data Lake Prod. So a different application that, in this case, hasn't had any dependency mapping run. There's no policy, but there is one cluster. And that cluster is Data Lake Importer.
Okay.
So if we go back to policies and we attempt to add a policy, so it's the same sort of outcome as we'd get if we were to try and discover the policy. We can enter our Data Lake Importer cluster as the consumer. And we want to be able to access banking web as the application tier in our core banking app. So banking web, you can see here that we can see scopes. So the banking prod, the core prod app itself, the overarching group that makes up that application, but not the specific cluster that is the web tier.
So because we're stood outside of that application workspace. Those clusters are simply not visible. They're private to that application.
That's right. And we'll discuss how, let's say, policy is exchanged between workspaces in a more detailed module a little bit later. But for this one, we're going to look at how to expose a service. So as an application owner, I can expose a service so that it can be consumed by other applications specifically, because I'm not going to let anybody just access all of my services on HTTPS.
So you're saying I can take that web server and I can flag it as public and let other applications provide or use that as a provided service?
That's right. Yep.
Okay. How about we take a look at that on the whiteboard quickly?
I think it's a great idea.
What you're showing to me right now is that you can access the, or you can see the scopes. You can see the scope banking, core, and core prod. And what we have represented on the board here is the same. So we can see the scope, core prod, which we know happens to have the web tier in it, also the database tier and so on. But from the perspective of the data lake prod application, here let's say I'm the data lake importer cluster, I can't see these ones inside that application. I can only see the external service of the application, or the application in its entirety.
Correct.
So if I were to create that policy, if you were to put the provider being banking core prod, what you would be effectively doing is saying, I want to open up from data lake importer to the entire scope of core prod.
Correct.
Now, just looking at it, that seems not an ideal way to open up that policy.
Correct. And as the application owner for core prod, I'm not going to let that happen to
You're
you.
not going to let that happen. I understand.
It's nice of you to knock on the door and ask, but no, that's not something that I want to expose. So the door is kind of closed until we do something about that.
Okay, so yeah, you're saying you don't want those guys that are doing that big data analysis to come suck up everything in your database. And if you created that policy to the scope, that would actually allow access to more than the web server. It would allow access to everything inside that scope.
Yep.
So we're saying we'll take this web tier, and we were going to click that promote to inventory filter.
Yep.
And that's going to allow that web tier to be visible from outside of the application, if I'm correct.
That's correct. And we'll see when we actually do that. There are a couple of options you have when you expose the filter, and one of those is to expose it as a service, and we'll take that option.
So if we actually pull this one off of here, and we wipe away web inside, what we're actually saying is by creating that external service, we are bridging that gap between the inside and the outside, and we are creating a new one that is representing the web tier.
Yep.
And in that case, I would be allowed to directly access the web tier from the service here. I would not have to refer to the entire scope.
That is correct.
I could refer to web, and that would be a much more secure way of creating that communication.
That's right, and it's really about requesting access to a more specific part of the application. Okay, which I, as the application owner, would be much more amenable to.
How about we take a look and do it?
Let's give that a shot. Okay, so at the moment, we can only see the scopes. So let's switch back to our Banking Core app. And we were looking at our clusters, and in particular, the Banking Web cluster. And we saw this little rocket ship icon here to promote to inventory filter. Let's take a rocket ride, Tim.
Let's click the rocket ship and go.
So what this is telling us is that we've got a group, it's currently a cluster, and to expose it, we need to turn it into a filter. We've got a query that's associated to that, and it's currently matching three objects, 3 workloads, and we can see what they are. And it gives us just another point of validation for that. What we want to really define here is the
scope is looking right.
Yep, the scope that is providing that service. And we also have these options here that I mentioned earlier.
Yep.
So this one in particular, providing a service external of its scope, is the one that allows us to expose that group for consumption externally. And you can see by default that is enabled. So by us now promoting that cluster, we are going to do exactly what you showed on the whiteboard there to present that for external consumption.
So when you clicked promote and you clicked the rocket ship, it pre-filled out everything with the right details. You didn't need to change anything.
No, no. All we're doing is we just sort of do a little bit of validation there, and then we hit the promote button. And what that's going to do is to convert the cluster to a filter and to expose that as a provided service.
Okay, so the cluster moved from the clusters UI. It was actually taken away from that part of the system, and it moved over to the provided services here.
That's right. Yep.
Okay.
And you can see here again, we're sort of confirming that a service is provided. We'll get into more detail around policy requests, autopilot rules in a different module around advanced policy.
Okay.
So let's just switch back now to the Data Lake app, where we were attempting to request that access earlier. So I'm just going to switch to Data Lake Prod. We're going to define a manual policy here from the consumer Data Lake importer to a provider. Now, if I type banking now, you will see not only the scopes that we had earlier, but at the top of the list is banking web, which is the filter that's the provided service from the banking core app.
Okay, so now I can create that direct relationship to the web tier in specific.
Correct. So we can now create that. We can add a service. In this case, we'll add TCP 443, as we know that's what we're trying to access it on. And we've now got a rule in our Data Lake app that is going to be able to request access to the web tier of core banking.
Okay, that seems like a scalable way to deal with abstracting a large complex service into one public interface.
Yep.
And it seems like it's going to keep things more secure doing it that way as well.
It does. It provides an ability for the app owner to give a much more specific access to certain components, but still retain control over that. And again, the workflow around that we'll explore in more depth in a subsequent module, but just the ability to take those services, bring them out for external consumption, we've covered that here.
Okay, seems simple enough.
So that concludes this module on provided services. For more detail, please go to cisco.com/go/tetration. Thank you.